because we have a culture that supports burning out. If you look at the top 10 American values, 2 of them are hard work and individualism, and those are recipes for burnout.
I'm Heather Grish, and this is the Wisdom of the Body podcast. This podcast explores the idea of body intelligence as the real key to learning the knowledge of life, or what we call Ayurveda in the ancient language of Sanskrit. We do that by connecting with today's creative leaders and experts who will help you listen to your body, trust your gut, and live in deeper harmony with nature. Come join me as we unlock the golden door to clear, direct perception and become very deep listeners. You can find the Wisdom of the Body podcast on Apple, Spotify, and Stitcher. You can also follow us by joining my email at heathergrish.com or on Instagram at heathergrish. I know you're going to love this podcast, so take a second right now to subscribe. Today, I'm here with Cait Donovan, who is one of New York City's leading burnout experts, host of Fried the Burnout podcast, and author of the book, The Bounce Back Ability Factor, End Burnout, Gain Resilience, and Change the World. Her master's degree in traditional Chinese medicine enables Cait to combine Eastern wisdom with her natural practicality. After performing more than 25,000 acupuncture treatments, Cait added one-on-one coaching, corporate workshops, and keynotes for companies such as PTC, Lululemon, Vetter Price, Marsh & McLennan, and Workplaceless, all with a focus on ending burnout culture. She has been featured on podcasts and online magazines such as Forbes, Elephant Journal, Thrive Global, and Addicted to Success, as well as quoted in Oprah magazine. Thanks so much for joining us today, Cait.
Thanks for having me, Heather. I can't believe it's been so long.
Oh my goodness.
That we've known each other.
Yeah, we met 11 years ago.
Yeah.
So Cait and I met 11 years ago as students in a yoga teacher training in the Costa Rican jungle. And a lot has changed in our lives since we met.
Yes. Yes, it has.
I mean, on my end, when I met you, I was 32. I was married. I was trying to have a kid. I was in this well-paying and completely boring job. And that trip to Costa Rica, which was essentially, it was like my eat, pray, love moment in my 30s. And I totally blew up and transformed my life from that trip. And I know at the time you were a lot younger than me. And I'm wondering if that trip was also very transformative for you, because in some ways, even though you are younger than me, I felt like you were somehow clearer on your path than I was back then. Now, that was just my impression. I have no clue what you think about it or felt like inside. Why were you there?
I was there because I needed to be with myself. I just needed to be with myself. I had moved about 3 years earlier. I had moved from California to Poland to get married and all of that. And I had been in Poland for a few years, and I just needed time that belonged to me. Like, I never planned on teaching yoga. I didn't do it in order to become a yoga teacher. I did it because I needed that time with myself. So I just went to be with myself. And, at the time I don't even remember, 28 maybe? I think I was 28 at the time. So not that much younger than you, really.
Were you an acupuncturist by then?
Yes. Yeah. I had been an acupuncturist already for almost 5 years at that point. I went to acupuncture school really young. There was only one person younger than me in the entire school when I was there. So that was not typical. And I was definitely ahead in that regard. And I thought that I was ahead in the rest of the regards too, but I was not. And then I burnt out.
I love it. We are going to talk all about burnout today. We're going to talk about your book, The Bounce Back Ability Factor. And it's funny, I would say that I went there as well to be by myself. And I was thinking back and I was going, okay, was I burned out back then? I don't think I was quite. I think I actually got burned out later. And I know burnout has a lot of different meanings to different people. And I was wondering, how do you define burnout?
I don't define burnout on my own. I use the research, and the research is clear. Burnout has 3 components. One of them is physical and emotional exhaustion. The second is cynicism and detachment. And the third is a lack of feeling impactful or accomplished in your work or in your life. And so that's the definition that Christina Maslach and her research team came up with. That's the definition that the World Health Organization absorbed when they declared burnout to be an occupational hazard or an occupational phenomena in the middle of 2019. So I stick with that definition because I think that one of the biggest issues in the world of burnout is that there's a lot of people talking about it that don't actually know what it is, and everybody's just sort of defining it for themselves. So we have to start with a core definition so that everybody's on the same page. So I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel. I'm not trying to pretend that I did all this research on my own. I am standing on the shoulders of the giants that came before me and using the information that we have that is well researched and well documented.
So it kind of sounds a little bit, from the definition that you read, it sounds a little bit like psychological and energetic.
Psychological and energetic, absolutely. There's no way burnout affects every single part of your body. So when you say, if you just take the first component of burnout, it's physical and emotional exhaustion, which physical exhaustion can be anything from fatigue to migraines to irritable bowel syndrome to fertility issues. Anything can be physical exhaustion. If we think about it, a mitochondrial level, if your cells are not getting the energy that they need, then your body's not functioning the way that it should. And whatever system is sort of weak in you constitutionally, or say you had an injury in a system at some point in your life, that's the thing that's going to go wrong. So if you had whiplash when you were 12 in a car accident, when you're burnt out, one of the things that will bother you is your neck,
Yeah, totally. That seems to be what happens in my life for sure. No, but any injuries are creating these little weak spots. And then when we get out of balance, that's where it's going to hit you.
Right.
How common is burnout?
Depends on what you're reading. Anywhere from 48 to 74% of people, based on the current studies, have experienced burnout or are burnt out right now. So pretty common.
I'm sorry. That's insane.
Yeah.
It's not surprising. I get it. I'm kind of curious what the pandemic did for burnout. Did it make people more burned out? Worse?
Much worse. Much worse. Much worse during the pandemic. And I think this is twofold. One, there was a bunch of people that were already burnt out that had no idea that they were burnt out, and the pandemic taught them that they were burnt out. And two, people were thrown into, especially parents, and I say this as a non-parent, just the amount of adjusting and the extra teaching and the having your kids home all day while you're still trying to work. And I'm just talking about people that were able to work from home, which is technically easier than people that have jobs that require them to actually be somewhere. So I think that the level of uncertainty that we had, the level of fear that we had, the constant fear mongering that we experienced. These are the amount of deaths today. This is how many people got sick today. This is what's happening in another country. This is how awful everything is. That amount of fear really irritates our nervous systems. And when you need to recover from burnout, one of the things that you need to ensure is that you have a nervous system that's able to reset itself and let your body know that it's time to heal. And when you're burnt out, it's really hard to do that. And it's also really hard to do that when you're under attack, basically. And we've been under attack.
You mentioned fear, and I'm super curious. What do you think the relationship between burnout and fear is?
Well, it's, again, twofold. So there's always a couple of different areas that you can look at it from, because burnout functions as this holistic system. So kind of everything that's a cause of burnout is also a symptom of burnout. So fear sort of fits into that. When you have an amygdala, so the part of your brain that responds to threat, when you have an amygdala that's overactive or hyperactive, even if you're not feeling fear on a regular basis, your body is interpreting threat on a regular basis. And so when your body interprets threat on a regular basis, your nervous system is overloaded all the time. And that means that your sympathetic nervous system is constantly working. You're in fight or flight. You are busy. Your digestion isn't getting enough blood flow. Your uterus isn't getting enough blood flow. Your muscles are pumped to the max because your body is prepping you to fight or flight, to run, or whatever else. Sometimes freeze, but that's a whole separate conversation, really. And then in the flip side, when you are hyperactive and hyper aware and your amygdala is on fire, you're going to interpret more things as fearful and as threatening, even if you wouldn't normally consider those things fearful or threatening, because you've lost your ability to filter your emotions through the front portion of your brain. So you're just getting your animal response to every situation. So somebody sort of cuts you off with their shopping cart and your body interprets it as a threat.
I just want to say that that's sort of how life felt for me growing up in New England.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's just interesting because culture, I feel like, and I know you've lived in both the US and in Europe, in Western Europe, right?
Eastern.
Oh, in Eastern, yeah. So just this idea that the environmental influences that you have around you and that culture could influence some of these things. Like certainly even you could go to something like a work culture contributing at the end of the day. And then there's obviously individual practices that need to be implemented in order for people to develop some of the skills that you're going to be talking about today. So when people are burning out or on the way to burning out, do they feel it?
It depends. So there's something, when you study hypnosis, there's something called threshold. And threshold is this tipping point where someone has decided that they have to make a change, they have to be responsible for that change, and the change needs to happen now. And everybody hits threshold at a different time. So sometimes you don't notice, quote unquote, your burnout because you haven't hit your threshold yet. So I think that it's really hard to, I don't really believe that people are like, I'm on my way to burnout. Like if you're thinking that, you're already burnt out. Like it's too far. It's too far gone already. I don't think that we can do a great job preventing it because I don't think we realize it's happening until we stop functioning in some way, shape, or form, emotionally, physically, mentally. A lot of people say when they're burnt out, a lot of my clients say like, am I stupid? Did I get stupid? I swear to God, I've been smart my whole life and I feel stupid. But your brain is offline. You've lost nerve cells in your brain. Like you literally have lost the ability to think clearly and make decisions and plan and organize. So I think it really creeps up on people more than anything else, which is why I don't talk a lot about burnout prevention on my podcast or in my work. I talk about burnout recovery because nobody's preventing burnout before they have it. Like that would be like telling everybody that they have to be preventing heart disease, cancer, and everything else before they have it, which some people are living a generally healthier lifestyle in order to prevent the whole gamut of possibilities. But unless you've really experienced something, you often don't take everything into consideration around that because it's a lot of work and a lot of effort. And if you don't need it, then it feels like effort that's not going to pay off.
Yeah. Whenever I hear the term burnout, well, there's a couple things that come to mind. You're going to laugh. So one is, what we're talking about here is burnout. And two is this term that was used in high school for people who smoked a lot of marijuana.
Yeah.
They were called burnouts. Was that a word
Yes.
that was used? Okay. Actually, I was kind of curious if there was any connection between those two terms, but off the top of my head, it doesn't seem like there is. Just a word that was used in two different ways.
Yeah.
But in Ayurveda, we talk about in Chinese medicine, you have the elements as well. And we talk about the fire element. And when I hear burnout, I always think of an excess of the fire element in some way, which we might say is, either pitta dosha in Ayurveda contributing to that. And that then to me sort of links toward transformation because fire and the purpose of fire is transformation. And I guess like, can a person get burned out if they're not very ambitious?
I think that you can, because a lot of the reasons that we burn out end up being coping mechanisms that we created as children that stop working for us as adults. So even if you're not overworking and even if you're not pushing yourself and even if you're not, then you can still burn out if the way that you're acting in the world is effortful. So for instance, being from New England myself, there's a lot of anger, first of all, and aggression, but nothing compared to Poland. So New England feels very calm to me now after being in Poland for 6 years, But the other thing that's inherent in New Englanders is there's a huge amount of consideration for other people. Like when you're in the grocery store, people always pull their cart over to the side. There's always somebody getting out of your way. People let each other go. Massachusetts is like so angry, but every time I've ever needed to make a left turn, somebody has stopped and let me go. That doesn't happen other places necessarily. It doesn't happen in Poland, that's for damn sure. And it doesn't happen in Jersey, I'll tell you that.
It doesn't happen in India, and they don't even have stop signs.
Yeah, exactly, right? So there's a level of, like you were saying before, culture that will affect it. There's a level of personal experience that will affect it. So you don't necessarily have to be working too hard to burn out, which is really confusing to people. And the other thing that's really confusing to people is you can be, and most of the time you are, at the top of your game when you finally notice burnout. You have enough money to support yourself. Everything in life is sort of going okay. And then you look around and you're like, why do I hate this?
Oh, yeah. I've had those moments. I had those moments all throughout my 30s.
Yeah.
And it's hard. You've worked on a lot of people as an acupuncturist, and I know you do coaching as well, but you've worked on a lot of bodies.
Yeah.
You've seen a lot of bodies come into your office in a state. They're coming in, they're like, I'm ready to surrender. Some stuff's not going right here.
Yeah.
You know, what are the forms that you've seen burnout take for people?
So this was just a recent podcast episode because I actually realized that I had about 75 people who self-proclaim as burnout. So these are not acupuncture patients. These are separate health questionnaires that I've sent to people over the years. And there was a list of 75 people that have filled out these really in-depth health questionnaires that I have for Chinese medicine, which, you know, like Ayurveda, you ask about everything. So the biggest things that come up are neck and shoulder tension, headaches and migraines. So those things obviously go together. Digestive upset, and all different kinds, from heartburn to IBS to constipation. You know, I kind of put them all in one category so that people would understand that kind of anything can go wrong depending on what your body is doing. The biggest emotions are anger and disconnect and anxiety. So it can be any combination of all of those things and more. Another one that I guess didn't really surprise me, but I wasn't looking for it, was low to no libido. 50% of people that are burnt out say that they have no to low libido. That's massive. So that in Chinese medicine is the fire, right? So your fire for life, like the things that turn you on metaphorically, mentally, emotionally, and physically. And when you're burnt out, that fire is gone. So on one hand, you know, you can say there's some like smoldering, there's fire symptoms. Your nervous system is on fire and there's some smoldering heat trapped in your system. But the pilot light that sits in Chinese medicine, the anatomy is the pilot light sits between the kidneys. It's called the Ming Meng. And your pilot light is like out. That's what burnout is. There's just no more light. There's no more energy coming in. There's nothing being created.
You said it's Ming Men?
Ming Meng, yeah.
Well, this is the term for digestive fire.
Agni, yeah.
Yeah, Agni, yeah. I'm wondering how similar those two ideas are. Because this idea that, like, you have your digestive Agni and then you have your cellular Agni. So, like, each part of you has its own sort of Agni.
Yeah, so in Chinese medicine, the Ming Men is the source of all the other fires.
Ooh.
It's the original fire.
I love it. It's like,
yeah,
very profound. And yeah, so people are coming in, and I have memories like of not sleeping, working too hard. Sleep's probably a big part of it. And
sleep is a big one, yeah.
There's things that you talked about in terms of what people were experiencing of that group of 75, that idea of the emotions of anger or anxiety or even disconnect. The disconnect piece is pretty interesting because I almost wonder if there's a precursor to that, if that's something that happens after for people, that something sort of gets damaged along the way and then there's a disconnect, or is it?
Yes, the prefrontal cortex, the brain. Yeah. So the part of our brain that connects with other people and is able to empathize and sort of like, you know, mirror neurons and all that kind of stuff sits right behind your forehead. And it's called the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex loses nerve cells. Like literally your brain is shrinking. So you feel dumber because you sort of are dumber temporarily. They can regrow. Don't worry about it. You know, this is not a forever thing, but it does happen. And when the prefrontal cortex loses neurons, it loses that ability to connect with other people. And you lose your ability, like I said before, to filter your emotions. So you end up being sort of real hard to be around because you can't filter your emotions. So people don't feel great when they're next to you because you don't feel great yourself, and you have no way of sort of keeping that in. There's a lot of explosive emotion. There's a lot of feeling alone. You can't connect with people because you don't have those nerve cells right now, or you have less of them. Not that you don't have them at all. It's just there's less of them.
This just sounds awful. None of us should ever want to be burned out.
No, it is awful.
Yeah.
People that call me are in a state like it's really bad. And I think that we don't always realize how impactful it is, but it destroys every part of your life. Your relationships are screwed up. Your work is screwed up. I have people constantly telling me that not only do they feel stupid, but they feel like they can't get ahead at work because they can't get their jobs done well, but they've done their jobs well for 10 years. And now all of a sudden they're like failing and they can't figure out what's going on. I'm like, well, we need to regrow your brain before you're going to be able to do that. Burnout is really not great. And because it's not really a diagnosis, the World Health Organization calls it, an occupational phenomenon or an occupational hazard. It's not a diagnosis. It would have to be a syndrome, right? And there would have to be, like depression, a list of symptoms that you check off. And when you have like 10 out of 18 or whatever, they're going to call it burnout. But the way that burnout hits your body and your mind and your spirit is different in everybody. So it's almost impossible to make that list. I think we're going to come up with some better research in the future. And there's some more research happening right now that will get us to a more clear place. But we don't have enough information right now to really help people understand what's going on and to tell them for sure, like what's going on with you is burnout.
I would imagine it probably also manifests at different speeds for people and in different contexts, so that somebody might be like, there's no way I could be burned out because the conditions of my life and the circumstances that led me to here are different than the other person that I knew was burnout that one time.
Yes, exactly. And I find this a lot with people who are wealthier, that they have this sort of lack of acceptance that they could be burnt out because they have this idea, well, other people's lives are harder than mine, so I don't deserve to be struggling with my life.
Like, okay, so I don't have to work 3 jobs. How could I be struggling kind of thing? Oh, yeah. It's almost like the things we do to ourselves, though, are worse.
Yeah.
Oh, my God. And you've lived in, because I know your book is all about solutions to this, too, about what happens like after you burn out and how do you bounce back.
Yeah.
And I know you wrote the book and you published the book at the time right after you moved back to the U.S. And you were born in the U.S. You lived in Europe for a long time, moved back to the U.S., published the book. Have you seen the same kinds of burnout in the U.S. and Europe, or are they different? I get so excited. I get this like kind of goosebump feeling when I get a booking from a new client that I haven't met yet. And I get so excited because I know that somebody has made a decision to go really, really, really deep into their healing. Because I know that Ayurveda is not a quote unquote normal thing that many people have access to, at least not in the United States where I live. So I know that when someone books with me, that they've really made a decision that they want to go deep into their healing. And so you could do that on my website at heathergrish.com. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. You can book me for either a Ayurveda consultation if you're ready to dive in, or you can also book me for a 15-minute connection call if you're not sure where to go yet. I do have a couple offerings that are not on my website, and we could talk about that. So I look forward to meeting you.
Check when it really boils down to it, underneath it all, they're the same. I think that there's a higher incidence here because we have a culture that supports burning out. If you look at the top 10 American values, 2 of them are hard work and individualism. And those are recipes for burnout. If you think, like, we have this strong belief in this country that if you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, then you're better than other people on some level. And so we try to DIY everything. We don't ask for help enough. We think that we have to be successful on our own. Let me tell you something. Nobody's ever been successful on their own. That self-made man had a lot of people supporting him. That self-made woman had a lot of people supporting her. Like, you don't ever do anything alone. But we have this really deep interest in individuality in this country. And I think it's not healthy.
why would we ever think that we do things alone?
I think because we don't know how to be proud of ourselves unless we've done it alone. Like, we don't know how to hold space for gratitude for others and pride in your own efforts at the same time. We either have to be totally humble or boastful. Like, not a lot of people have learned to live in that middle place where we can say, yes, I did some things, but also I was lucky. Also, I had some help. A lot of times when I start with new clients and they're in this place where they don't have gratitude for anything, which I think is fine. You have to focus on resentment when you're burnt out. It's not the time for gratitude. It's not going to work. It's not going to help your brain. It's not going to do the things that it says it's supposed to do in the books. It does not work. So we skip gratitude. We go to resentment. But when it's time to start sort of thinking about gratitude, instead of thinking about really specific things, like gratitude journals are always like, write that you're happy about this particular mug that fits in your hands this particular way and keeps your, drink warm for the amount of time that's pleasant for you. Or you're supposed to get real specific about what you're grateful for. When I have people getting to the point where they can feel gratitude again, I start to say, I just want you to notice how many people have to exist in order for you to do the basic things in your day-to-day life. So you sit down and have breakfast. And that breakfast is served on a plate that was made by somebody somewhere and packaged by somebody somewhere else and shipped by somebody somewhere else. There's probably 120 people had to exist just for you to have that plate. And then you have eggs and vegetables and, chickens had to lay those eggs and somebody had to collect them and somebody had to put them in a box and somebody had to get them to the store and you had to, on and on and on and on and on. And just to take the time to think about the fact that there's nothing about our lives that is actually disconnected, no matter how disconnected we might feel sometimes. I'm looking at my desk right now. I have a glass that had coffee in it this morning, a glass that has water in it now, a textbook for a development and aging course that I'm doing now, my computer, a lamp, some notebooks, my phone, my Kindle. Do you know how many people had to exist so that I could sit at this desk? Probably like 5,000. Just so I could sit here with this stuff right now. And so we focus on that a lot. We talk about just noticing how many people that you'll never see had to exist so that you could do the thing you're doing right now.
Well, not me. I'm way too self-important, Cait. No, I'm just kidding. No, it's really powerful when you talk about it like that. I mean, it's the seeing the interconnectedness of things. And oftentimes, perhaps people are putting pressure on themselves because they think they have to do everything. They don't know they have people that are already supporting them. And that,
right.
I have two friends that are about to have a baby. And I said, hey, my biggest piece of advice is get as much sleep as you can. And in the first month, have everybody bring you food.
Yeah.
So you don't have to cook. And he's like, oh, I don't like to accept help. And I was like, dude, you're having a
tough
kid.
shit.
You better accept help.
Yeah.
I was like, wow, because it's hard, it's hard to do anything.
Yeah, it really is. And what's interesting about that is there's a huge obsession with resilience right now. And that's part of burnout, right? Like when stress wears down your resilience, you end up burnt out. But there are a few characteristics of people that are more resilient that we could do an entire podcast episode on that. I'm not going to get into it, but there is one behavior that people that are more resilient have. There's one behavior, literally one. Guess what it is?
Optimism?
Asking for help. Being resilient has nothing to do with actually figuring everything out on your own. But because we're so obsessed with being individualistic in this country, when we're defining resilience and we're like, well, I'm resilient. When we say I'm resilient, that kind of means like I can put up with anything, and it's like, that's not the idea at all. The most resilient people know when to ask for support and who to ask and how to get it.
My response was such a yogi spiritual bypassing response.
It's a good example though, Heather. I think it was perfect because that's what people say and that's what people think. That's natural. That's what resilience is supposed to be. And it's like, no, the number one behavior that you need to embrace to be a more resilient person is asking for help, is to not do it on your own. That doesn't make you less resilient. It makes you more resilient. Isn't that wild?
I believe you.
I mean, it's a Harvard Business Review. It's not, I didn't even make this up. Harvard said this. They're smarter than me.
So, and I'd love to hear, I don't know if you want to share any stories about your burnouts in your own life. And I know you've written a lot about this in your book, and you've written a lot about the reasons people burn out. You've written a lot about some of the tools, because your book is about bouncing back, bounce back ability factor. What are some of the tools that help a person become more bounce backable?
So for me, bounce back ability is just this idea, this deep faith in your own ability to return to some version of yourself, not necessarily the version of yourself that you left behind. Your ability to get back to a place that feels better to you. And the components of bounce back ability are resilience, grit, trust, and surrender. I'm okay with grit. I'm okay with hard work. I'm not saying that you're never going to work hard again. I don't believe it, like you're saying, the spiritual bypassing of like, if you love what you do, everything will be easy and it'll all be lovely. And no, it won't. Sometimes you're going to hate it because you're going to be in a bad mood because somebody cut you off and your son's in the hospital and something else happens. Like, life is messier than life coaches want it to be. So I think that understanding first and foremost that it's okay to have grit. It's okay to, I don't like really the word hustle very much, but it's okay to like push sometimes. But there are moments that require you to have more trust, more faith, more surrender. And that's what makes you bounce backable, not just pushing through, but sinking in. So that's really important. The next thing that I think, as far as tools, my favorite tool and the one that shocks everybody, we already sort of spoke about it today, is a resentment journal. I have a course on this because you need to work through the resentments in a very clear and structured way, because where you feel resentment is where your boundaries have been crossed. You might have been the one to cross the boundary, just to be clear. It doesn't mean that other people have crossed your boundary. It means you might have crossed your boundary. So, you say yes to something you didn't really want to say yes to, and then you're resentful about it, for instance. So working through resentments teaches you where your boundaries have been crossed, where new boundaries need to be instated, and helps you save so much energy, like more than anything else I've ever seen, because resentment is a huge energy suck. And a lot of us are not admitting to it. We're not paying attention to it. And we're pretending to be grateful for things. And we're writing our gratitude journals. And we're rolling our eyes at ourselves as we write them because we're like, oh my God, this is such crap. Get into the resentment. Figure out where your boundaries have been broken down and how to build them back up in a way that doesn't make you sound like a jerk. Boundaries have nothing to do with being rude. They don't have anything to do with being aggressive. They have everything to do with being clear, kind, and concise. Learn to do that, and you will grant yourself so much bonus energy that the rest of your burnout procedures will be easier because you'll have energy to do them.
So the resentment exercise that you're talking about, understanding where the boundaries have been crossed. I'm sitting here going, okay, what am I resentment on? I'm going to work on this with Cait.
Oh, you're going to think about it now for a whole week, I promise.
I'm sure I will. And actually, I did read this in your book. I read it before, but I want to read it again. Just sort of what is the process? Obviously, when you become aware of a resentment, you have to be aware that it's there, right?
Yeah. So you're looking for moments that you're like passive aggressive, or that you really feel like you need to explain to somebody on some level how much you're doing for them because they don't understand how much you're doing for them. To be honest, they don't care. You're overgiving. You're giving too much. Like, they don't care. It's not their business. But when you feel like you have to explain things to somebody, when you find yourself being like poking thorns in people, you just, I'll show her kind of thing. Like, all of those moments, those are that's resentment. So first we'll get clear on what it feels like, kind of, and then you start to write it down. I'm feeling resentful and this is the situation. So you just start writing it down just so that you get clear on what's actually happening. And then we have to start looking at this situation objectively. So we have to remove ourselves from it and say, okay, whatever's happening in here that I'm resentful about, does it have to be happening? So usually there's some sort of action involved. Like, does this action need to happen? And 20% of the time it just doesn't need to happen, and you can let it go and move away and just stop doing it and be over. So that's wonderful, because 20% of the time that's what's going to happen. If it needs to be done, the next question is, do I need to be the person to do it, or can it be outsourced to another person or a piece of software? Right. So one of the things that was really bugging me when I was still in Europe, I was in Prague, and I was seeing 45 to 60 patients a week. And I was getting 45 to 60 emails to schedule patients a week. And it takes 7 emails back and forth on average to schedule an appointment. When I got an online calendar, it's like the sky opened and the angels sang hallelujah.
I'm
Right.
literally like because I know you're on Clubhouse all the time too. And I was like trying to clap for you with my mic.
It's just like, so good. So sometimes you can be making the situation easier somehow, either by delegating it or by upgrading a tool that you're using, upgrading a software that you're using. I talk a lot on my podcast about being mad at your pan every morning that you fry eggs in for breakfast. If you're scraping eggs off the pan every damn morning and every damn morning you're pissed about it, buy a new pan, please. Like, you don't have to be resentful towards the pan. Just get it. That's something that most people, I understand that not everybody, but most people can go to TJ Maxx and get a $15 pan and not be angry every morning.
Why do we keep using the pan though?
Because we don't pay attention to things that are bothering us in our overarching life. Because if we paid attention to all the things, then we'd be really overwhelmed. So we learn to ignore things when they bother us. That's why we get burnt out. So paying attention to the stuff that bothers you is part of burnout recovery. Let's get rid of as many things as we can. I love resentment now. When I feel resentment piling up in my body, I'm like, oh, look at this boundary that needs to be put into place. That's interesting. I didn't realize. Right? But it helps me. It makes it easier. When I notice it coming up, I say, okay, well, this needs to shift. And sometimes it's, you need to swallow this because this is actually your mistake and you do need to fix it. And it's not anybody else's fault. And you're blaming someone for it, because when you have resentment, you're always blaming someone. So you're blaming someone for it and they don't deserve that from you. So you need to slow your roll, sister.
And then your body has, because we're talking in a way about mind and energy and emotions, but the body has actually shifted because of it.
Yes, exactly.
You know what we do in Ayurveda to release resentment?
What?
We make you drink castor oil and have to run to the toilet all day.
Oh my God. My method is way gentler. I just want you to write some stuff down and figure out who you need to have conversations with. That's all.
Yeah, but at the end of it, you're not 10 pounds lighter. Or are you?
I mean, yeah, sometimes you are.
Right? Because then,
metaphorically speaking, at least.
But there is this thing, right? Because it's like you could go at any problem that we have through the mind or through the body. And if you go through the mind, it's going to affect the body. If you go through the body, it's going to affect the mind too, right? So don't you think that the work that you're doing on the level of mind and energy and emotion is going to translate over to the physicality?
Yeah, and we do a lot of somatic-based, body-based work in my coaching, because I don't believe that you can only go one direction. You can't only go body-mind. Most of the time, people that have burnt out have only gone mind for a long time. So I have to use that skill because it's one that they have and one that they're familiar with. But I do have to teach them how to get back into their bodies and use that too. So we do both and.
Yeah. What are some of the success stories that you could think of from people that you work with?
Oh, it's so fun. At some point last year, I finished with a client and we were getting toward the end. And she was like, I'm a little nervous. And I said, yeah, but you're ready. Like, you don't need me anymore. So you're ready. You're fine. And she stopped and she said, these past 3 months were more powerful for me than 5 years of therapy. 5 years of therapy. And I stopped and I thought, ugh. And on the other hand, you might have only been able to do this because you had 5 years of therapy. Maybe that therapy was prepping you for a different kind of work. I don't know, but it is pretty powerful to get really real with people. One of my big things is let's just be honest. So when somebody starts talking about something and they're like, well, this is the problem. And I'm like, but don't you actually mean this? And they're like, oh shit. Yeah. And you can't do that as a therapist. That's not your role as a therapist. It's not technically your role as a coach either, but I don't do strict coaching because when you're burnt out, coaching is supposed to be you're asked questions and you find your own answers. And when you're burnt out, you don't have the brain for it. So there's got to be a little more prodding and a little more illumination of the truth. Because when you see it and you see it happen, you say something that's true for somebody, and even you're on Zoom and you just see their shoulders relax, their eyes spark again, they sink into their chairs and they're like, oh my God, I didn't realize. So I think those are my favorite moments where people are like, okay, I don't have to live like this anymore. I can make different choices. I know where this comes from, but I don't have to relive my traumas. Like, I can just move forward.
Yeah. And it's that like reliving of trauma piece. I know you wrote about that in your book. And like, to what extent you do have to, like, what would you say, like, do people have to relive their traumas
No.
at least once in order to sort of get through this?
No, I don't think so. I don't think that the actual thing that happened is not what's important when it comes to burnout. The coping mechanisms that you created after the thing that happened is what's important. So, for instance, I'll just give an example. My father went to rehab for drug use when I was 6. And when he got back as a 6-year-old, my internal decision and my mental processes as a 6-year-old said, there's no more mistakes left for our family. He used them all. So now you must be perfect. You must be perfect because there's no mistakes left. And you also must be perfect because your parents have been through enough and you can't burden them. Right. So I got perfect grades. I got a full scholarship to college. I did all the right things. And that perfectionism worked for me as a coping mechanism. I was praised for getting good grades, not just by my parents, but by my community. I finished 12 out of 600 kids in my high school class. I got almost a full scholarship to Boston University, which is one of the best schools in the country. So I was getting recognition for a coping mechanism that would eventually crush me. But that doesn't mean that the coping mechanism in and of itself was bad. It was good for a long time until it became a burden. But I kept doing it because I had always done it and it had always worked. And it stopped working and I didn't understand why. So I just kept continuing. Like, if I just do it better, if I just keep being perfect, it must not be perfect enough because things aren't working anymore. But the thing that wasn't working anymore was the coping mechanism in and of itself. So I don't need to go back to what happened. I need to know what coping mechanism I'm using on a day-to-day basis that is outdated and no longer supporting me in the majority of areas of my life.
I love that so much. And thank you so much for sharing that, Cait. I actually didn't know that that had happened to you when you were really young. And what I'm hearing you say is that because there are a lot of people who've been through traumas, and we've all been through traumas, right?
Yeah.
There's no one who's not been through trauma.
Exactly.
So they're all different. And then
Yep.
also the weird thing about trauma is that one thing will be felt differently by one person than someone
Exactly.
else, right?
Right.
So it's really relative. And it probably comes down to this piece of, well, one perception, but then the other is like, what do you do to yourself after it?
Exactly.
What do you do to yourself?
Yes.
I love it. And I really feel like you've illuminated that today for me as well as the audience. So I thank you so much. It's really important. I think, I always butcher this. One of my mentors used to tell me this story. It's like, I always butcher this story, and I may have even mentioned it on a previous podcast, but there's two monks and they're crossing a river. I don't know if you've heard this one.
Yeah.
And there's a naked woman. Do you know this one?
Yes.
Okay. You want to tell it? You might tell it better than
No,
me.
it's okay. If you go too far off, it'll ring you in.
Okay, good. So the two monks are walking and there's this woman, she's naked and she's trying to cross a river. And one of the monks goes and he sees that she needs help and he carries her over the river and he comes back to walk with his other monk colleague and they keep walking. And the monk who didn't go over and help the naked woman said, I can't believe you just did that. And the monk who helped her said, I did that way back then, but you're still doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. So the idea behind it was, they're not supposed to touch women at all. And so the second monk was like, well, you're not supposed to touch women. Like, what the heck? You're not supposed to do that. You broke the rules. And the other monk was like, yeah, but I put her down 2 miles ago and you're still holding her.
Yes. And
yeah,
it's like this part of ourself that continues to beat ourselves up for something or soothe something.
Yeah, soothe. Exactly. Like, these coping mechanisms are soothing, and generally, like, I don't demonize people's coping mechanisms because you wouldn't have repeated them if they didn't work. So they probably worked for a really long time, and they'll probably still work for you in certain areas of life. It's okay to still use them. They just don't have to be so prominent anymore. So they need to be updated and upgraded. And that's okay. We all have to do that,
Yeah. All right, Cait, what else do people need to know about burnout?
If you're burnt out, that's probably more information than you wanted anyway.
Yeah, because if you're burnt out, you probably really just want to go grab some of that stuff that I mentioned would cause people to be called burnouts in high school.
Yeah,
to
exactly.
sort of like
that and castor oil and have yourself a party.
But we know none of that's a long-term solution.
No.
Yeah.
No, it's not.
Oh my God. Thank you so much for being here today. It's been great fun.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad to reconnect with you after all this time.
Yeah.
Over a decade. It's wild.
And if anybody here is wanting to learn more about your book, your work, they're burnt out, they want help, how can they get in touch with you?
I think the best thing to do is to head to the podcast. Fried the Burnout podcast. Dig into that. All of my contact information is there. All of the links to everything is there. But there's going to be a lot of questions that you want answered that are already answered, and that information is just sitting there ready for you. So I would go there first. Dig around a little bit. See what resonates with you. And then take it from there.
And you'll know you found it when you see an egg frying in a pan.
There's no egg, but there is a cast iron pan with the words Fried the Burnout podcast inside of it. Yeah, but people do remember that, and it's awesome. It's one of the things that I'm most proud of. I did not do that alone. I designed that logo with a bunch of family and friends that were following my business page at the time. We did 27 different versions of it, and over the course of one day, they kept saying, oh, make this bigger, change this color, and I would do it and then post it again, and then they'd give me feedback again. So that logo I created, quote unquote, but I did it with the help of my community, and it's just my favorite thing.
You heard it from Cait. It takes a village, it takes a community. Thank you so much for being here today, Cait.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for tuning in and dropping in with us today. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. I really want to hear your feedback. To learn more about my work, visit heathergrish.com. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. And meet me here next time on The Wisdom of the Body.